Okay. You think I've done this 5 times already, but I still, I'm a little technically challenged sometimes. But welcome everybody to our Shifting Gears webinar series. We're so excited for you to join us. And today's actually our last Shifting Gear. We're going to be talking about shifting landscape. And really the last 6 weeks has been about providing our clients and just organizations that could benefit from this conversation. We've talked so far about finance and accounting, HR, we've talked about cybersecurity and mental health in the workplace. These are such important topics right now. And today we are going to be hearing from Torod Neptune. So again, this just seems like so funny because I was thinking about this earlier today. I've known Torod for 32 years. Is that true, Torod?
Perhaps. I'm much younger than you though, so.
Okay, so anyway, so I've known him for a very, very long time. I've respected him as a professional. I've respected him personally, and really excited to hear the things that he's going to be speaking about, how to use diversity and inclusion innovation to build a world-class workforce. But I want to share you a little bio about Torod, a little bit about him. So Torod Neptune is the Senior Vice President and Chief Communications Officer at Medtronics. He joined Medtronics in February 2021 from Lenovo Group, and he was the Worldwide Group Vice President and Chief Communication Officer there. He is a seasoned global leader who was named to PR Week's 2020 Power List of 50 most influential and impactful communications professional. He has a proven track record of managing complex brand reputation, public policy, and issues for large global businesses in highly competitive regulated industries in both direct-to-consumer and business-to-business companies. Torod serves on the board of directors for the LeGrand Foundation, an organization dedicated to increasing the number of ethnic minorities in the field of advertising, marketing, and public relations through scholarships, professional development, mentorships, and internships. In 2019, Torod received the Paladin Award from the PRSA Foundation because through his career, Torod has not only been a strong advocate for increasing diversity and inclusion within PR and communication, but a driving force in moving the industry to action, challenging agencies and companies to be thoughtful and about putting forward diverse teams among other initiatives. He's also a member of the Board of Visitors for the University of Southern California's, oops, that's a Freudian slip, right? Southern California's Annenberg School of Communications and Journalism and the Board of Advisors for the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill's Hussman School of Journalism and Media. Recently, he was recognized in the North Carolina Media and Journalism Hall of Fame for his diverse work and ties to the state of an individual who had significant impact on the profession and the communities they serve. Torod earned his bachelor's degree in government international affairs and journalism, global affairs, and Soviet and Middle Eastern foreign policy from the University of South Carolina. Please welcome me in joining Torod to our conversation today.
Okay, I'm sharing my screen here. Can you see that? Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, all right, super. So again, thanks for that introduction, Mia. Thanks for the setup. I'm going to, again, to Mia's frame, share some slides that, for good or bad, are a little more weighted on the business case up front, that I think generally, if you're involved in this space, you care about this space, are passionate about this space, you'll be aligned to some of these things. And then hopefully a little more discussion in an area that I think will be interesting to everyone around some myths and realities, and where I think I spend most of my time today, really trying to unearth how to address this issue strategically and fundamentally. So a little bit of an apology for spending so much time on the business case up front, but I do think reinforcing the compelling data that we know exists around the value of the way we think about this, I think is a helpful frame for us as well. And so again, if I think about why this issue matters to me beyond what might be obvious to you all as an audience, I think one of the things that I've appreciated throughout my entire life is when you have grown up understanding what it means to be excluded, and not being allowed to participate, it makes the importance of this topic more critical. I think when you've grown up being, told actually and subtly that for some reason beyond things you can control, you may not belong in a certain place, it makes the importance of this issue more significant to me, and I think to you, the proverbial you, as a priority. I think one of the fascinating things, and we'll talk about this a little, toward the back end of this conversation, again, as I have gotten engaged at a leadership level in this discussion as a business priority. And if you think about some of the more significant things that are happening across our society today, I mean, we are at I think one of the most tenuous inflection points I think we ever have been as it relates to this topic. And so again, beyond the data that we'll spend a little bit about, I think there's a fascinating and intriguing conversation we can have about this tension around the moment that we're experiencing today and whether or not progress is going to actually result from all of this. And so, but again, just in terms of the setup, in terms of, obviously, I think diversity is one of those things that we all think differently about depending on our lens or our frame or where we come from. But I do like to kind of set the broad context for people in terms of what it really is today, beyond the traditional demographics or ethnic or cultural realities, to help us kind of baseline the conversation in a way that's a little more broad and contextual. And I think also this will frame some of the conversation that we'll have around why is this such a challenge? Why is progress so challenging? And more significantly, as we think about some of the macro societal issues that are being borne out today, why we're having some of the challenges that we really are. So beyond diversity, again, equity, depending on where you sit as well, you either hear about this topic today as D and I, or D plus the E and I as a new entrant into this discussion. And so I think it's a helpful frame. And in some ways, I think for us to contextualize, the distinction between, when we think of things, our concepts like equality, equity, and liberation, for example, I think this is a fascinating creative treatment to help us understand when we talk about equity, what we're really talking about. Because again, I think we'll appreciate as a group the realities of, based on your frame, whether that's geographic or cultural or where you originate from in the world, it influences the way you think about equity or the opportunity that exists for equity. And so I do think adding equity to this traditional conversation around diversity and inclusion is key, but I think sometimes that we don't appreciate in terms of what it really means. And this is ultimately the aspiration for us as leaders when it comes to that concept. And then lastly, I think this is clearly more intuitive for most of us when we think about inclusion. And again, I like the emotive nature of this creative treatment for unpacking inclusion in a way that perhaps feels less political, but is more attuned to the reality of what we're talking about. And I think we're more sensitized to it, either as parents of children or people who are aware of this when it relates to something that might be more age driven. But this is fundamentally the imperative that inclusion is designed to help us think again strategically about. So not just through the lens of ethnic inclusion or gender inclusion, but in terms of a community or a collective. And fundamentally, I certainly, as I have grown in my career, see the importance, the imperative of inclusion for a number of reasons that we'll get into in terms of talking a little bit about the compelling data that exists. But again, as a frame for not just diversity, but equity, as a concept, and us kind of baselining around what that is, again, not through the myopic lens of gender or ethnicity, but through this participation, inclusion, involvement, I think is also a great setup before we dig into this a little more significantly. And so that being said, this idea of the right combination of all three of those matched with policies and practices that enable us to think about how we address these issues is really the North Star. And again, I don't want to minimize this concept of the right policies and practices that create the playing field for this to be a significant imperative for all of us to deliver against, whether you're sitting within the nonprofit community or in the traditional corporate community, or even more broadly. And again, the policies and practices piece of this, that is significant. We'll talk about a little toward the back half of this discussion. But that increasingly, certainly from my vantage point as a corporate executive, is where we have the most need to focus and engage, given some of the system and structure issues that really I think about often as the last mile of solving this problem, right? So if there's alignment intellectually around the imperative that is DE&I and the reason that it is a business imperative, the real work that's got to be done today is in two areas. I'd suggest leadership, and I think I would prioritize that as issue number one, and hopefully will help frame that for us as a group today around where we have the biggest opportunity and perhaps the commitment we need to make to lean in. But then secondarily, leadership as a tool to influence system and structure. And increasingly, I see that as where I have the largest obligation and responsibility, given the seat that I sit in, to drive change. And so again, this is where I'll speed up a little bit, because again, some of the data behind this that again, I don't think we'll find questionable or that this group would find debatable, but I do want to reinforce it for the point that it is not DE&I because it's a good thing to do that we want to feel good about, or DE&I, it is not a reflection of our current societal reality, and therefore it's a priority. It is a fundamental business, right? And again, I think we've all gotten to the point where this is a given, but increasingly I also realize that it's something that we can't assume is where we have shared perspectives or shared points of view in terms of the value of it overall. And so again, I'm not going to drain these slides in terms of discussion points, and feel free if you have a counter thought or you want to weigh in to push. But this business case is getting stronger and stronger in terms of compelling data across the board that helps us kind of reinforce the importance of this, in addition to it being the right thing for our organizations to commit to, both for a talent, recruitment, retention, retain, kind of great place to work. We increasingly look at this as one of the more significant drivers, given the global shift that's taking place around stakeholder expectations about the kinds of organizations that we all want to work with and be a part of. And again, generationally, if you start to unpack it, toward the younger demographic that we're all focused on recruiting as well, it is even more significant of a critical expectation requirement. And so these benefits, I think that are largely intuitive. I wouldn't necessarily prioritize them, but I would certainly suggest that the hiring, recruitment, and retention one is going to continue to be the driver of organizational and leadership focus around this. If I think about my children and again, the workforce demographic that is beginning to be engaged, and it is a clear imperative for them. And so I think that's something we can't lose sight of as well. And so moving this conversation along a bit in terms of what it looks like, diversity without inclusion has the downstream impact as well. So it's not all upside in terms of the business case, and the outcomes and data that we know are positive indicators of what a diverse, inclusive, and representative workforce looks like. But there's also the negative data that we also are beginning to see in terms of trends for workforce environments that don't reflect this as well. And so I never like to lean in on the negativity, but I think, again, us all putting on our leadership management kind of business leader hats also need to understand there's a bit of risk mitigation as well that we need to be cognizant of in thinking about how we prioritize this beyond not just well-being and performance, individual and organization, but things as pedantic as revenue growth and this concept of attachment that's also attachment engagement, employee attachment, employee engagement that's also becoming a significant discussion point in terms of the rationale for this as an organizational priority. So we don't just want employees who come to work and are happy about coming to work, whether that's digital or not, but we also want them increasingly tied into our organizations mentally, intellectually, physically. And so this concept of attachment that we can see the data around growing worse when there's not a diverse and representative organization is something as well that, again, we're starting to see a lot more discussion around. And so, again, in terms of walking through this conversation, not to drain some of these slides, but when we look at this concept of an inclusive, engaged workforce, there is a sales revenue, commercial, value that we also know is unbelievably strong today in a way that we've not seen this data bear out in the last several years at all. And so this customer sales, commercial value opportunity, market share growth opportunity, I think is increasingly, again, not to overweight the importance, but as we know the stakeholder expectations for organizations and prospective employees, prospective talent, as we think about the kinds of places that we want to commit to, that we see as attractive environments, again, this kind of data is also beginning to color that in a fairly dramatic way. Personal performance as relates to our teams. And if we look at that across the board, this is another area where I was in a conversation with my HR colleagues in the last couple of weeks as well, as we, Medtronic, are entering into our annual performance planning process. And so I think when we've started to look at data, and this is aggregate data, this is not Medtronic data, this is kind of macro industry data. But when you think about the value imperative of inclusion linked to performance at the individual level, again, a compelling case for the importance, the significance of when we think about managing for performance and adding the layer of inclusion to that, we know, right? And this is intuitive, but again, this data is in some ways shocking if you think about the left end of this bar, and from exceeds to greatly exceeds expectations. Again, the power of inclusion and what that means for our workforces, again, whether that's commercial, nonprofit, or wherever you may sit, is pretty compelling as well, and I think needs to help frame this context for us. So I talked about this a little earlier, and this again I think will be a great discussion for us. But when we think about policies and what those policies can do hand in hand with a workforce and leadership committed to this cause, it's strong. And so this is where I reference the systems and the structures and the leadership role that I think is perhaps the last mile for us in terms of fundamentally addressing this issue once and for all. And so I think it's critical from the leadership accountability for diversity, supported by really strong metrics. And this is an evolving body of work. I am heartened that increasingly I find year over year organizations at a leadership level are doubling down, kind of committing this accountability concept, right? Moving it from a nice to do, a nice talking point, and a nice marketing exercise to real accountability. I have found, as is the case for me today, and it's been consistent, when you have KPIs that are tied to commitment in this area, financial and otherwise, that's how you get the attention of an organization and a leadership team. And so Today my compensation is affected by the degree to which our organization is successful at these metrics and driving diverse, inclusive, representative KPIs. That increasingly is, again, one of the mechanisms in terms of driving system and structural change that I think as organizational leaders, we're going to have to consistently focus on. It's not easy and it's not comfortable, but this is an example of us, holding our organization's feet to the fire and our individual leaders' feet to the fire around, if we believe it is a cause and a commitment that we're making, we got to have that accountability, including a number of these other areas as well that I think are significant to thinking about how you combine a commitment with your policy procedures, and then look at obviously the downstream benefit that we're talking about here as well in terms of what it means for our organizations in general.
Can I interject something here?
Yes.
Obviously I work with, I would say 99% of my clients are nonprofit organizations. And I would say out of the, 30 nonprofit organizations that I work with on a pretty regular basis, I would say maybe 10% of them still are only the ones that are looking for diverse candidates. I mean, they literally ask me for diverse candidates. They're asking me, where am I posting these jobs? Is it just LinkedIn? I mean, just had a conversation with a client yesterday that said, okay, we're going to have to spread our search, even though LinkedIn can provide some really great candidates for us, to really be able to say that they represent the population that they serve. They're saying, I want you to go to, these specific associations or other nonprofits that post jobs to create a larger, diverse pool of candidates. And I feel like that's a conversation that needs to be had with more nonprofits. If I say maybe more than 10%, maybe out of 30 clients, I would say maybe about 7 of them are saying, okay, I want you to go and make sure you get me a diverse pool, And so it's happening, but and they're committing to that. And it is happening from the top down. I mean, the CEO of this one particular one I'm thinking about is very serious about DEI, but I don't think that is still in the nonprofit space focused on enough.
Yeah. No, it's a great point. And I do think that outside in, to your point, the conversations around the rationale or the why for this beyond the business imperatives, and perhaps that's a great ad that you just referenced. There is a growing understanding, and maybe it's an enlightened leadership understanding, that the real desire here is for my organization, our organizations, to reflect the stakeholders we're trying to influence, engage. Whether those stakeholders are customers, whether they're members in a trade association sense, or depending on the nonprofit, right? But that is the inflection point. So, and you can think about that through 2 lenses: either proactively getting in front of it before our organizations are called on the carpet, because your organization doesn't look like, the people that are funding your organization, right? Or again, the proactive kind of leadership enabled focus on, this is a business imperative for all the data that we've just looked at. And also, it just doesn't make strategic business, organizational, operational leadership sense for those of us around this table who don't understand the way to think, operate, behave, and don't have the perspective that our audiences have, the audiences we care about. There's a risk mitigation management approach there as well. And we see it publicly and I had some slides that I took out, but again, we all will recall them. There's some great examples of organizations that have done just really, really bad things, whether that's across brand, marketing, or operational things, that are a result of people trying to own insight for a demographic they don't represent. And that really is also a great way, I think, to frame that point around this outside in. And I do think that's an additional nuance to not just the business imperative of what we're talking about, but there's also a responsible kind of leadership management given the audiences we're trying to influence, and that we all expect today if we're consumers, we're funding, we're paying, we expect the organizations that we're funding, paying, supporting to reflect our perspective, right? Our point of view. And I think that's also a big part of what we're talking about here as well. So motoring along a bit here again, and I know Mia will have these slides after for people to have, but back to some of the data around where we're going and the imperative of this focus and a growing body of research that is affirmational around the power of diverse and inclusive cultures and market share. Again, the financial data in some ways is becoming shocking in terms of how compelling it is increasingly becoming. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, I think the takeaway is diverse teams deliver, and they deliver again to a factor of X, depending on which nuance of this you're looking at, in a way that is almost embarrassing to see how compelling the data is, and yet there's still this tension around the degree to which we're able to make it an organizational and a business priority. But again, it's a beginning. I'm trying to stay optimistic. I often, as opposed to focusing on where there are still gaps, I am optimistic, and the data I think helps reinforce the importance of kind of aligning around this. But there's still some realistic issues that we've got to resolve. And whether you think about that from the leadership level, from boards down to C-suites, down throughout our organizations, or again, depending on the organizations that we all represent, just the individual leader role that we all can play and should play in this. So this is an interesting slide that I like to use often as well in terms of diverse teams.
Can I ask you to go back 2 slides for a second? One more. Okay, so I just want to give you a little comparison from some information we pulled from a September 2019 survey of executive directors of foundations. It's just obviously a segment of the nonprofit. The stats showed 75%, I'm just comparing here, identify as white, 60% identify as female, and then this is just unbelievable, 90%, so from 60 to 9% identify as African American or Black, 6% identify as Hispanic, and 4% identify as Asian. So really the nonprofit is, on the high end, it's really just, it's pretty similar, isn't it? That's a bit, not shocking, but shocking.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting, back to this slide, and this is, if you think about the bottom half of this and, this conversation, again, back to the business reality and discussions that I'm often part of. But if you look at this last data point in terms of the decisions made by diverse teams, I mean, think about a team that you've been a part of. If you could increase the success around the decisions it makes by 87%, right? So diverse teams make better decisions 80% of the time than non-diverse teams. Obviously, better categorized, over whatever the business or operational or organizational challenge. But the other conversation that I often have to try and help me frame this in conversations, not just with my team and my organization, but in general, is I'm competitive, and fundamentally as a leader in an organization, my first desire is I want to win, and I want to win, right? And I want to beat the competition. And so if you're telling me I have a mechanism beyond some of the really challenging things that we've got to unearth, right? How to grow, sale, there's some real fundamental business challenges that are not easy to unearth. But if you're telling me I have a mechanism that I can pull fairly easily that will increase by the X factor of 80-ish% the level or quality of decisions that my team makes, again, that's a different conversation for me to have as a business leader who wants to win, right? And so I think that's also, again, not to kind of reinforce that point, but there are not a lot of examples where you have that significant of a data draw that can influence this conversation in a way that's compelling. We all want to win. We all at some point are leaders with accountability for driving organizational success, regardless of where we sit. And again, thinking about the ease of that mechanism. So again, I won't drain this slide again in terms of more or less, but again, another contextual frame for this conversation. At the same time, I do think getting to a little bit of the challenging discussion, some of this data is not moving to the degree that we want it to, need it to, both in terms of the reality organization today across, ethnicity, gender. And I think this is, where it gets to be a bit challenged in terms of the demographic reality for us. That is a helpful layer overall. But I think, again, begins to paint a picture of the reality of the issues that we're trying to deal with that are also, they're tough and they're entrenched. And again, back to the system and the structure conversation that we had a little bit already. I think this slide is an example in my mind of the power of systems and structures that have been in place for a long time. And when we look at the power of this discussion we're having against the reality of, again, where our organizations still sit, we all understand the work that we have to do. And again, I think the women demographic is an interesting aspect of this conversation as well, where again, some entrenched issues are also, in terms of the gender diversity challenges that we're confronting. Something is that, that is becoming a more significant. 13% of the global tech executive workforce, women. If you think about, what's surprising, perhaps shocking for some of us still, given the sophistication of that industry. But again, I think reinforce, some of the system structural realities that our organizations are really going to have to grapple with to deal with this. This is the, women demographic across STEM, and then kind of macro tech jobs across the US in general, just as a data point, because I think, this women's issue is something that we've been talking about. Actually, I'd say we've been talking about it longer than we've been talking about the broad kind of ethnic diversity challenges. But if you think about the number of years it's taken us to even get to where we are today, when it comes to gender diversity, it's a reflection of just the significance of the challenge and the opportunity. And so if we get into STEM, kind of computer science and others, as this slides alludes, it's even more challenging. So for the last third of this conversation, I suggested these myths and facts I thought would be an interesting frame. And then I'm going to close with a couple of suggestions for things that we can all individually think about or take back. And Mia may have some to add there as well, just in terms of leaving the conversation. But I do think it's a helpful frame to engage in some of this. And so, we spent a lot of time here talking about the business case. And again, I didn't want to overplay this, but I do think there is this view that still exists around the business case not being as strong as it is today, but it is. And I think the reality for us is that it's still not easy work. The business case is strong and compelling, and I increasingly am not able to find people who challenge that. So that still is a strong myth today, but I think the real opportunity is that it's still not easy. Again, back to the structural and system kinds of things that we are challenged with. That is the last mile in many ways. And so I think numbers, one of the other myths that I've increasingly found prevalent today is this view that, and this is, I'll say this with the caveat being, the net positive as our organizations are getting much more sophisticated about the data driving this discussion and being able to analyze and chart progress or momentum. We obviously produce an annual global scorecard that shows across ethnic, gender diversity, the whole thing. And so that is a clear net positive as our organizations are committing to transparency and openness. And even within the nonprofit sector, it's becoming a significant focus area in terms of accessing the data, having it, and then disclosing it, both in terms of the aspirational goals, targets, those kinds of things. But again, I think that at the end of the day, that is the beginning for us. And so we've got to look at also inclusion as the key to activating, these benefits as well. And so not just reporting out on the data, but the reality is, how we think about activating in this area becomes just as important. Training being the other area that's increasingly, growing popular and more significant. And again, I'm not going to drain these in terms of reading, but again, I think in some ways this reflection of kind of what this conversation looks like through the lens of how we engage and how we think about this is an area as well. This concept of, being patient, persistent, diligent is what's required. And, I talked about it through the lens of leadership, or leadership as the last mile, given some of the system and structural things that I think are probably the last barrier for us to really address this. But it is a big opportunity, and one I think, unfortunately, we don't talk about enough. And so I often describe myself as impatient when it comes to this topic. And I think that's probably a more accurate reflection of the leadership disposition we've got to bring to this discussion in terms of, driving progress across this last mile, as I refer to it. So that was 3 or 4 kind of high level views. I think, again, back to the setup of some takeaways in terms of actions that I have consistently seen be things that influence the way we can think about as, again, individual leaders in terms of our accountability, regardless of the size of the organization or regardless of the role we play, but also some actions for our organization. So this concept, I'm still surprised by the degree to which there is not a compelling DE&I strategy in place. And again, not that it solves all of the problems, but I think the discipline and rigor that organizations engage in when they commit to building a strategy, a plan that's focused on, for whatever your organizational reality, that's focused on your journey and charting your journey and being open and honest and facilitating within the organizations this conversation. And I think this could be, from a 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, small kind of nonprofit organization on up through the way a kind of big global enterprise would think about it. But the importance of this organizing frame, organizing construct in a strategy, I think can't be minimized. And again, I think this group would probably appreciate the value of that. And then the secondary concept, that we just talked about a little bit around the data and measurement piece, both in terms of charting the journey, but building aspirational goals that are authentic, that are grounded in the reality of the organizations we're a part of, but also that realize, again, back to that leadership opportunity, we've got to be pulled out of the unbelievably strong pull of either doing nothing or driving incremental change. And so I think that's where, again, open, honest, and transparent, focused on the data and a measurement philosophy and approach there is key. And then again, we talked about the inclusive culture piece. And so there are many ways to be creative about, building an inclusive culture. Some of our organizations, cannot get there tomorrow in terms of having an organization that looks and is, but there are also creative ways to look at how we can do that using a mix of, external resources and being creative about collaborations and partnerships and those kinds of things as well that allow us to influence our organization while we're on the journey to build the optimal organizations that we've been talking about here that truly are kind of benchmarks for DE&I and are made up that way.
Can I ask, can you go back one slide, Torod?
Yes.
I'm just thinking about my clients, and I think, the ones that are, working on DE&I, obviously they're doing their part. But I find that most of my clients are stuck and almost don't know what to do to start a strategy. Does that make sense? They okay, they know they need to pick up the phone and call a strategist, right? That's about the extent of it. I don't even know that they necessarily, you know, use their network to figure out who those individuals are or those resources are. But I think a lot of them are just so overwhelmed with kind of the state of nonprofits right now and just the uncertainty of kind of how things will shake out with the pandemic, with decreased revenue. And of course, building a DEI strategy, although well worth the money, is an expensive, process. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it was what I was trying to get to in terms of, this first bullet on building a strategy. I don't think it needs to be over engineered to be something highly complex and that requires engaging 4 or 5 consultants and vendors. And there's a way to begin. And one of the other things I often say is I have a clear vision of nirvana, which where I want my organization and the company to go, but you've got to begin that journey. And so that journey can be as simple as, what are the 2 or 3 organizational commitments that we're prepared to put a stake in the ground around today. And those don't have to be world changing, world hunger, poverty alleviation kinds of things. It could be as simple as, what kind of, over the next 12 to 24 months, how do we want to think about diverse pipelines and slates, or engaging an external firm to help us diversify in those 2 or 3 areas. And so I'm always an advocate for thinking about it as simplistically as possible, with an understanding of nirvana, right? And so incrementalism is not a bad thing per se, as long as we're building towards something. And I think to your point, you think about the nonprofit sector, it's a great example the last 18, 19 months or so, where many are in survival mode or just maintenance mode. And so I wouldn't want us to be overwhelmed by thinking about beginning this journey by focusing on nirvana as the aspiration. Nirvana is the vision, but I think there's a very, very simple way to start. And I think that's probably the better question for someone who's, kind of thinking about this the way you just framed, as opposed to, I have limited dollars, limited people, limited resources. Where do I start? So, and again, this is actually, I think, the last slide in terms of this overall frame as well, but again, more focused on just some ideations for, employee and team. And so I think, again, regardless of the organizations we sit in, kind of trying to think through the individual and what as individuals, can we do to begin to be, kind of advocates, allies, partners of the mentality, the approach here. And so these are, 3 that I think are largely intuitive, but again, I think are a helpful frame for me, for those of us who may just be thinking about this through the lens of our roles as individual contributors somewhere in an organization or somewhere in the world, is a helpful setup as well. So with that, I thank you all for the time, and I don't know how you want to manage the last part of this.
Can you go back to the last slide? Last week, Maxine Somerville, who's on this chat, talked about culture. Actually, a good bit of her presentation was about culture. And I was just, as I was reading your 3 suggestions, I thought those have to be cultures, part of the culture that's created in order for people to speak up and be a champion for DEI. Because I mean, when I think about the number 1 reason why people are not promoting DEI, I think it's either ignorance or fear, when they're doing a lot of things at Engender Health to promote that culture where people can speak up and express their opinions and their ideas. And I think that, in order to get people to speak up, you have to create that culture. And then even about getting educated, that's something the employer, I feel like, needs to do, is provide that, education. I think the people that, like you and I, that talk about diversity, I think we can get tired of talking about diversity, and I think it would be helpful to get an outside person to be able to speak about it from a informed, but also objective perspective, right? Again, I think that comes with culture. I don't
Yes.
know, Maxine, if you want to chime in on anything here, but I think that, you did such a great job last week about talking about culture.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add here, Mia. I think those are all really good points. You have to, if you want to get to a place that DE&I is ingrained into your culture, then you have to create the space for those conversations. You have to create the safe spaces for those kinds of conversations. So without the culture, D&I is, not likely to be successful.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a leadership responsibility, creating that culture, but there are also creative ways, to your point, whether that's outsiders. For my global team tomorrow, we're actually having a quarterly meeting, and one of the things we're facilitating is a fireside chat on DE&I, and there are two outside speakers who we're bringing in to help us, to your point, kind of reinforce the cultural understanding that this is important, and we want to be open and honest. And actually, the frame for the conversation is, the title for the fireside chat is "Just Say It." Say it. And again, it was designed to reinforce or address a little bit of what has been a not as publicly stated concern people have around, I'm not comfortable talking about some of the concerns I have. And so that's an example of a little bit of a risky undertaking, but a decision we've made to commit to that.
Okay. A couple questions, Torod. Any suggestions on how to best get educated on how to combat bias?
Yeah, today, there's so many resources that are available, but I would even suggest, before we get to resources, that I think one of the responsibilities and obligations we have is to ensure, if we care about this cause, we have to make sure that our community reflects this cause as well. And in that community, there are resources, people that we should also engage, in addition to the growing number of external resources that are available to us. And so the ease of getting educated today is much more significant than it was. But I also wouldn't minimize the importance of this community construct. There's a concept of filter bubbles where we've got to ensure we break out of just being confined to communities that kind of all are very myopic. And so there's a benefit to being amongst a community of people who think, behave, act, and bring different perspectives to us. That makes us better, more well-rounded leaders, executives, people. That's also a big part of that, I think, from my vantage point.
Okay. One other question. When we have plenty of different ideas, how do we decide which one to bring to life?
Yeah, I think that's probably an organizational question.
I was thinking it would be driven by what the mission of the organization is.
Yeah.
Okay. More questions. All right, hold on. What are your thoughts on including DEI metrics in executive performance evaluation and/or compensation?
All right, I'm all in, and that was the point I made around, you want to get people's attention, right? And so my executive compensation every year is affected by progress in this area. And so you want my attention, that's got it. And you want the attention of non-diverse people who may not be as committed. You start pulling that lever and watch what happens.
Okay. A couple more here. Companies, especially those in the US, may feel challenged by how to educate leadership on the range of cultural interests within DEI, Blacks, Latin, AAPI, LGBTQ, age, ability, faith. How should organizations approach?
Yeah, I didn't follow that closely.
Can you see that question, Todd?
What's the question again?
Companies, especially those in the US, may feel challenged by how to educate leadership on the range of cultural interests within DEI, Blacks, Latin, AAPI, LGBTQ, age, ability, faith. How should organizations approach?
Yeah, that's where I lean back on. this may be an example of where just external resources and this, this courageous conversations is one kind of mechanism we've used. And so obviously as a global organization, we have diverse voices, perspectives that we can bring in. Our ERGs is another resource that we're leveraging. And so if you don't have the benefit of, exposure to something along those lines, then I think that's where getting creative about, some facilitated discussions or, panels, or, there's so many people that are so compelling across all of these areas today, who are more than willing to kind of volunteer, commit, invest time. And so I think that's an easier consideration to think about. If you don't have the benefit of that within your own four walls, how to kind of bring that in, I think is a much easier consideration today than it probably ever has been.
Okay. Couple more. What are your thoughts on creating a psychologically safe space for people of color in corporate America? Any best practices you can share?
Yeah, I'm still trying to find my safe place, but yeah, I mean that's a great question. I mean, I think you said this a little earlier. I am tired of talking about this issue and this topic. And if you think about some of the things that are happening in our world today, and so the ERGs again, I think is a great example to this point. I think most corporate environments, again, I'm not as familiar with the nonprofit side, but I think ERGs have become an unbelievably valuable resource in the last year and a half, 2 years, to create within organizations kind of communities or sub-communities across ethnic, gender, the whole kit and caboodle, that I think has helped create safe spaces. And I think those ERGs have been used as a mechanism to create broader organizational awareness, dialogue. I was in one discussion a couple of weeks ago with our Asian ERG. And for obvious reasons, that was a great discussion because they were educating all of us, but also it was this very cathartic kind of emotional opportunity for us all to kind of share thoughts and and so again, that is a significant mechanism that I think is hopefully being leveraged across all of our organizations. And I think the mini version of that is probably, whether you're nonprofits or in other organizations, something that I think we also need to redouble focus on, given I think it goes directly to this kind of psychological safe space and the most credible, safest way for our organization to look at, how we might create those.
Okay. All right, Mike had a question. I'm going to go back up to the beginning. Sorry, Mike, I did not mean to ignore you. Actually, do you want to turn on your mic and ask Torod directly?
Yeah. Great information. Just fantastic perspective on this, Torod. I think just to give a little context so I could ask the question, thank you, is I realize that incremental change is not the goal, and leadership, like you guys are showing, is absolutely key. Advocating for minorities and the underrepresented, but leadership also is the responsibility of people who look like me, and it is our responsibility to help. And yet, I feel like Mia mentioned that it's an emotional decision sometimes before it becomes a logical one. You're presenting data, but the emotion behind it, like, I fear that my job depends on this hire. I don't want to look bad. I want someone who will replicate many of the things I do and do it the way I do. And the chances that will happen will be better, possibly, or it feels like it'll be higher if I hire someone like me. So walk me through, how do I get out of that state of emotion? Because I feel like as I'm looking at hiring folks in my organization, as I see the decisions being made, that process is going on, that thought process. So help me, in a sense, get out of the emotional, with an emotional argument that helps me embrace the data you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, and this is where others may have a point of view, but if you think back to this, one of the slides we were talking about earlier in terms of this 87% better decision making, right? And so the reality is that team that's made up of people who look like, think like, walk like, grew up like you is actually less productive, less impactful in terms of the outcomes it's delivering. So it may feel better to you because, you know, you're all in the same fraternity, you all went to the same school, right? All kind of had that same upbringing. But from a strategic business leader, I want to win, I would look at that team and go, I don't want anything to do with them if they're in my organization, because I can tell you the downstream impact of that. But you know, your point about the emotional comfort is also something that is significant. I appreciate you making that point, because that is, again, fundamentally where this challenge, you know, lives or dies. The degree to which organizations allow this recruitment, retention of people who make me feel good about myself because we have some shared interest, which is most often, you know, those things that run counter to, you know, what we're talking about here, DE&I. But it's a long-winded way of saying, I think going back to that better outcomes, better decision-making, that 87%, right, may feel better, but you're not driving a better result. And so at what point is that your accountability to your organization to drive a winning result and to have a winning team, as opposed to a team that you really like, right? And, you know, are excited about, you know, going out to happy hour with, Zoom happy hours or whatever it might be. And I think that's what it boils down to as well.
Thank you.
Hey, it is 1 o'clock and so grateful for this conversation. This could go on for hours and hours. Obviously, this is such a big topic in our world right now. But you know, we are at Chisholm Consulting. What we do is we really try to, now this is a real priority for us, to help clients that especially are looking for diverse and inclusive candidates. We're working with them to find them great candidates that will be successful in their organization. So if you have an open role that you need some help with, please feel free to reach out to us. Or if you just don't know what to do about this diversity and inclusion piece, reach out to us. We'll be happy to talk you through. We'll provide resources for you and really just help you to create the best workplace and workforce that you can have. But Torod, thank you so much for this time. We really appreciate it. Appreciate everybody's great questions. I will send out the recording and Torod's PowerPoint, which I think there were some great things that you could share with your colleagues. Again, thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. We'll be back, not right away, but we'll be back for some more information. So join us and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.